Hey guys, Connor coming to you from the World Divide. Today is January 13th. I just want to give an update on geopolitical events that are happening around the world. Particularly, I want to talk about, in this order, the Mexican cartel wars. I want to talk about what happened recently in Brazil, the January 6th kind of esque event that happened, where Bolsonaro supporters stormed many of the Capitol administration buildings, including the Supreme Courts, the presidential office, and a few other buildings. And then I also want to give an update on the recent developments and breakthrough that's happened in the Russo-Ukraine war. So I'm going to include this all in one video. Um, Starting with the cartels, um, we saw a few months ago the capture of El Chapo's son, and this came about after Joe Biden ended up visiting Mexico um, and presumably creating a deal with the president there. And with the capture of El Chapo's son, the Sinaloa cartel in northwestern Mexico is kind of in the process of collapsing. And as a result of that, we have another cartel called the Jalisco New Generation Cartel that's challenging everyone. And their goal is to overthrow all the other cartels and become kind of the sole dictator of what happens in Mexico. Um, so for the longest time, for the past couple of years, the Mexican government has kind of taken a hands-off policy on the cartels. They don't really have enough resources to deal with them, um, and it was more profitable for the government to leave them alone up until now. The violence has reached a point where the Mexican government can no longer ignore what's happening. And not to pick sides, but the Sinaloa cartel is kind of the one we want to win. The difference between them and the Jalisco New Generation cartel is that the Sinaloa cartel um, was always about business first. Of course, drug trafficking was their business, but their business is also to make sure that the people that they were controlling over um, liked them or was just generally tolerant of them. So they didn't bother people. They reinvested in the communities um, and actually made some strides to benefiting the economies in the areas they controlled. The Jalisco New Generation cartel is a completely different story. They are ruthless. They are warmongering, and will do whatever they have to show that they're in control and power, and that is what they've been after. There's been a decent amount of footage of them declaring this. They've declared war on every cartel in Mexico, and now the government is doing something about it. Um, Now, this is kind of the closest real physical threat the United States has had in a long time. I would say even back ever since um, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then before that, World War II. Um, we haven't had any real physical threat kind of even approaching this level. Now, the risk we run of the Sinaloa cartel losing and the Jalisco New Generation cartel crossing the border right now is somewhat low. Um, each side is fighting viciously. The Sinaloa cartel is dissolving, but it's still savable. Um, and I think our primary efforts now should shift to dealing with this issue and building better ties with the Mexican government um, in fighting cartel violence because it's spreading over the borders. Our immigration court systems and um, inability to properly deal with the immigration issue um, has caused certainly some concern around the country. The problem isn't necessarily the immigrants themselves, it's the fact that because they have a legal status, they're only able to use cash transactions, under the table type jobs, which makes them really easy to control and really easy to indoctrinate. Um, so we have had a continuous cartel problem inside the United States, and rural places where drug trafficking is popular, the cartels have taken over that. American gangs simply don't have the resources or the skill or the tenacity to be able to match these guys. Um, so, what should we do from here? Well, first off, the best thing for us would be not to have any cartels at all. But if that isn't an option, at least um, provide the Mexican government the resources that they need and um, secure the border of cartel activity. Um, we need to strip down our immigration court system and build a more efficient system in dealing with immigrants crossing the border. Um, because a lot of people are trying to flee because of the violence, and we're having a migrant crisis at the border. Um, so that's what we could potentially do there. We'll see how the situation develops. Moving on to Brazil, with the recent election that happened, Lula ended up winning over Bolsonaro. Um, of course, it's certainly reminiscent of the situation between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, where Joe Biden ended up winning. Donald Trump supporters ended up storming the Capitol and wreaking havoc all over the building, trying to block a vote to prevent Joe Biden from ascending to presidency. This situation was quite a bit less violent than that. What we saw first was kind of this storming of the Capitol buildings by Bolsonaro supporters. In Brasilia itself, the capital of Brazil, I've totally probably butchered that. The governor of that region is a Bolsonaro supporter. So he enacted measures to make sure that Bolsonaro supporters would be able to carry out these actions. And of course, the fear was that once this happened, the Brazilian military wouldn't back Lula and would decide to let the protesters continue. And I'm certain that the Bolsonaro supporters were making that bet that the military would stand down and not react and not do anything about it. And that didn't end up being the case. Approximately like 24 to 36 hours later, the Brazilian military moved in and was able to somewhat peacefully, arrest many hundreds of Bolsonaro supporters and clear the buildings. Brazil is certainly just a hard country to govern in general. There's always been difficulty with instability. And a lot of it has to do with poverty and the disadvantages they have with geography. They have a lush, very resource-rich interior. They have the Amazon rainforest, but they don't have consistent irrigation. They have to clear forest and create a soil that gets poisoned over time, and then continue to do that over and over again, which is causing the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest. At the same time, to get those resources out, they have to carry everything by truck, which has its own costs. First, you have to maintain the roads that go in and out of the resource-rich areas, which road infrastructure to build in Brazil, because of the difficult terrain, is 3 times as much as it is in the United States. And that's not even dealing with the fact that you have an escarpment of mountains almost all along the northern coast and moving all the way down to the southern coast. So getting things from the interior to the exterior to the coast is really difficult. Now the solution to this, and this would take a decent amount of time, and this is certainly a mistake Brazil made back then, when given the choice to invest in either road infrastructure or rail infrastructure. They decided not to. And I think the move now would be, if they could, to focus on investing in more railroad infrastructure, because when it comes to carrying goods across land, doing it by rail is by far and has always been the cheapest way to do it. Um, there's a lot less maintenance costs associated with it. You can carry a lot more cargo on one run by doing it. Um, and there'd be less supply routes that you'd have to worry about supporting. Um, so we'll see how Lula's presidency turns out, see if she can make some good changes. We've had a lot of populist voted presidents recently in Brazil, kind of similar to what's happened in the United States. There's certainly some connections there, but definitely different spheres of the world, different cultures, um, different geographies that they're dealing with entirely. Um, that's all that I'm going to give an update on Brazil. Like I said, with the cartel wars in Brazil, I will be doing a lot more research on this, and trying to kind of give as accurate of a judgment as I can on what's going on there. I would like to inform everyone I am not well versed in Brazilian politics, nor am I well versed in Mexican politics as well, but I'll be definitely starting to do more research on that in the future. Moving on to the Russo-Ukraine war. So we've had quite a bit of updates come from that region. We had a reshuffling of the command structure in Russia, certainly like broadening the command structure, the SMO, Special Military Operation, as the Russians like to call it. General Surovikin was moved from commander of the theater of the entire operation to commander of the ground forces, and now we have a new commander, Valery Gerasimov, I believe, as the new leading commander of the entire SMO. And then there's a bunch of other high-ranking officials that are filling other roles within this conflict. And so this news comes after the fall of a very important stronghold, actually north of Bakhmut, called Soledar. Now this was a very heavily fortified town. This is something that the Russians have been having quite a bit of difficulty capturing, and it's taken them a good 6-7 months with the methods that they've been using to do it, which is, as I've said before, to draw the Ukrainians in, to inflict as many casualties as possible while sitting back and using your artillery firepower advantage and reconnaissance tactics to have the most favorable casualty ratio possible. And this is something that they can achieve with their extreme heavy equipment advantage. So what we've seen that's made the capture of Soledar possible was first the capture of the settlement Yakovlivka, northeast, which was a settlement along a highway that the Russians had been really struggling to capture. Once they moved into Yakovlivka, it opened up the door for a northern flanking maneuver into Soledar. Another move that really brought them a lot closer to being able to do this was the capture of an intersection south of Soledar with a gas station on it. And the capture of this allowed them to get a vantage point of the northern suburbs of Bakhmut, as well as be able to move into the positions south of Soledar, the hilltop south. And from there, they enacted a pincer movement. They were able to capture the suburb of Bakhmutska and Soledar, and from there they were able to capture the two hilltops flanking either side of Soledar. And it wasn't too long after that that the settlement itself fell. Now, looking at the situation, the Ukrainians are definitely in a much worse position. I believe the collapse of the front between all the way up to Kremenna down to Bakhmut will end up collapsing. All of the roads leading in and out of the city are under fire control. Um, the Russians don't really have to work that hard to move much further west to gain physical control of these roads. And at this point, Bakhmut will be in a full cauldron, and the Ukrainians will have to move back. Um, and their next position that they're able to fortify, at least temporarily, will be the hilltops around Chasiv Yar. And then after that, they'll have to create up fortifications in Konstantinivka, running all the way up to Sloviansk, which is not insignificant, especially in the Donbass region. So, after the capture of Soledar, we had the restructuring of the command structure within the Russian Ministry of Defense, as well as promises to send main battle tanks to Ukraine from Poland, from Germany, from Spain, from Italy, and then also the promise from the United States to train Ukrainian troops in Oklahoma. Now, the media narrative on this has certainly changed. At first, it was kind of playing up the significance of Bakhmut, playing up how the Ukrainians are doing a very good job of holding there, and they certainly have been very tenacious and doing a very good job at holding back the Russians. Problem is now is that they don't really have many other lines of defense to fall back to after Bakhmut falls. Bakhmut is a very important city. There are 5 different highways running through Bakhmut. If Russia controls Bakhmut, we're going to see a similar situation to Popasna, where they spent many months trying to control this one settlement. And as soon as they did, they started flowering out in multiple directions. And then not too long after that, we saw the quick collapse, or the relatively quick collapse of Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. So we're probably going to see a similar thing happen to Toretsk in New York, further southwest of Bakhmut, and Seversk northeast. So this will significantly move the line forward, and it begs the question when the Russians will make their move. As it's been on some media sources talked about, a lot of times ignored. The Russians have been building up troop concentrations and forces all around Ukraine ever since late October, early November, and it's expected, at least the timeline that we're getting now from Ukrainian officials, is that they expect a large-scale offensive to happen sometime in early February, or maybe even February 28th, when the Russians started this offensive in the first place and escalated the civil war in Ukraine. So I'm going to keep an eye out, I'll watch and I'll see. But the capture of Soledar is certainly a very significant development. If the Ukrainians aren't able to slow down this progress, then we'll likely see a collapse of many important strongholds in the Donbass. Maybe even rolling all the way down to Avdiivka, Pervomaisk, Krasnogorovka, and most importantly, a linchpin in the southeast, Ugledar. So I'm going to keep an eye out. That's all I have for you guys today. I'm going to be keeping an eye on things that are happening around the world. I'll certainly do posts on my Instagram as well, at The World Divide on Instagram. Thank you for watching. Take care.